The late afternoon sun draped its golden light across the small town of Willow Creek, painting the picket fences and rose bushes in hues of warmth. At the end of Maple Street, in a modest house with a sagging porch, Margaret Ellis sat in her favorite armchair, her hands folded tightly in her lap. At 70, her face bore the lines of a life well-lived water, sorrow, and everything in between etched into her skin like a map of her years. Her silver hair was pulled into a neat bun, and her eyes, though weary, still held a spark of defiance. She stared at the invitation lying on the coffee table, its pastel pink edges curling slightly in the humidity. Baby Ellie's first birthday. It read in cheerful, looping font. The party was tomorrow, at her son David's house, just next door. Margaret's heart had swelled when she first saw it, imagining herself holding her granddaughter, singing lullabies, and sharing stories with the neighbors. But the joy had been short-lived. "You don't need to come, Mom," her daughter-in-law, Claire, had said over the phone that morning, her voice clipped and final. "It's just for Ellie's friends and their parents. You know, younger folks. It'll be too much for you." Too much for her. The word stung like a slap. Margaret had spent decades raising David, wiping his tears, cheering at his games, and teaching him the value of kindness. She'd been there for every milestone, every scraped knee, every triumph. And now, at 70, she was deemed too much for her own granddaughter's first birthday. She leaned back in her chair, her gaze drifting to the window. Through the lace curtains, she could see the preparations next door. Balloons bobbed in the breeze, and Claire was directing a delivery man with a stack of folding chairs. Laughter floated over the hedge, sharp and carefree, a sound that should have warmed Margaret's heart but instead deepened the ache in her chest. She wasn't frail. She wasn't some doddering old woman who needed coddling. Every morning, she walked 2 miles through Willow Creek, her sneakers crunching against the gravel paths. She volunteered at the community center, taught knitting classes, and baked pies for the church bake sale. Her hands, though spotted with age, were steady enough to thread a needle or knead dough. Too much for her. No. Claire's dismissal wasn't about Margaret's ageia, it was about her place in their world. Or rather, her lack of one. The hurt simmered, but beneath it, something else began to stir. A flicker of rebellion. A spark of the fire that had carried Margaret through life's hardest moments. She thought of her own mother, who'd faced exclusion in her time, shunned by neighbors for being a single mother in a small, judgmental town. Margaret had watched her mother rise above it, hosting potlucks and garden parties that drew the whole neighborhood, turning rejection into triumph. An idea took root, bold and unyielding. If Claire thought Margaret didn't belong at Ellie's party, then Margaret would show her what belonging looked like. She wouldn't beg for a seat at their table, she'd build her own. And it would be grander, warmer, and more joyful than anything Claire could imagine. By evening, Margaret was on the phone, her voice steady but brimming with purpose. She called her friends from the community center: Evelyn, who was 75 and still danced at the town fair; George, an 80-year-old widower with a knack for storytelling; and Lila, a spry 68-year-old who could outbake anyone in Willow Creek. She called the parents of the children she'd taught in her knitting classes, the ones who still waved to her on the street. And she called the local bakery, the florist, and even the high school band director, who owed her a favor. "I'm throwing a party tomorrow," she told them, her tone leaving no room for doubt. "Right here in my backyard. For everyone who's ever felt left out. Bring your kids, your grandparents, your stories. We're celebrating life. All of it." The plan came together with a speed that surprised even Margaret. By midnight, her kitchen table was covered with lists, guest names, food orders, decoration ideas, She sketched out a vision of her backyard transformed, strings of fairy lights, tables laden with homemade pies, and a stage for the high school band to play. There would be games for the children, chairs for the elderly, and enough laughter to drown out the party next door. As she climbed into bed, her heart raced with a mix of nerves and excitement. She wasn't just throwing a party, she was reclaiming her place in the world. Claire might have shut her out, but Margaret would open her doors wide, inviting everyone who'd ever felt dismissed or forgotten. Tomorrow, Willow Creek would see what a 70-year-old woman could do. The night was restless, filled with dreams of her childhood, of her mother's defiant smile as she welcomed neighbors into their tiny home. Margaret woke at dawn, her resolve stronger than ever. She pulled on her favorite blue cardigan, the one David had bought her years ago, and stepped into the backyard. The grass was still damp with dew, but the air held the promise of a warm day. She could already picture it, children running through sprinklers, elders swapping stories, and music floating over the hedge to Claire's pristine party. She started with the decorations, dragging tables from her garage and draping them with checkered tablecloths. Evelyn arrived first, her arms full of mason jars to use as candle holders. George followed, carrying a box of old records for the turntable he'd promised to bring. By mid-morning, the backyard was a hive of activity. Lila was setting up a dessert table, her famous lemon tarts gleaming in the sunlight. The high school band arrived, their instruments glinting as they tuned up. Margaret paused to catch her breath, her hands on her hips as she surveyed the scene. This wasn't just a party, it was a statement. A declaration that age didn't diminish your worth, that exclusion could be met with embrace, that a single act of defiance could spark joy for an entire community. She glanced at the hedge separating her yard from David's. The balloons next door were bright, but they couldn't compare to the warmth growing in her own backyard. As noon approached, the first guests arrived, families from the neighborhood, seniors from the community center, and children who'd heard there'd be ice cream. Margaret greeted each one with a smile, her heart swelling with every hug and handshake. She didn't know how Claire would react when she saw the gathering, but for now, it didn't matter. This was Margaret's moment, her chance to show that love and resilience could outshine any rejection. By the time the clock struck 1, the backyard was alive with laughter and music. The high school band struck up a lively tune, and children darted between tables, their faces smeared with frosting. Margaret stood at the center of it all, her silver hair catching the sunlight, her eyes bright with purpose. She wasn't just hosting a party, she was rewriting her story. And Willow Creek was listening. The sun climbed higher, casting a golden glow over Margaret's backyard. The air buzzed with the hum of conversation, the clink of glasses, and the occasional burst of laughter from the children playing tag near the rose bushes. Margaret moved through the crowd, her blue cardigan swaying as she greeted each guest. Her heart felt lighter than it had in months, each smile and warm word fueling her resolve. This wasn't just a party, it was a rebellion against being sidelined, a celebration of everyone who'd ever been told they didn't belong. Evelyn, her closest friend, was arranging wildflowers in mason jars, her hands deft despite their tremor. "Margaret, you've outdone yourself," she said, her eyes twinkling. "This is better than the town fair, and that's saying something." Margaret laughed, brushing off the compliment. But inside, she felt a surge of pride. The backyard was transforming into something magical, strings of fairy lights crisscrossed above, catching the sunlight, while tables groaned under the weight of homemade dishes brought by neighbors. George, the storyteller, had set up a small circle of chairs under the oak tree, regaling a group of wide-eyed children with tales of Willow Creek's past. His voice, gravelly but warm, carried over the chatter. "And that's how the old mill got its ghost," he finished, earning gasps and giggles. Margaret caught his eye and gave him a nod. He winked back, as if to say, "We're doing this, aren't we?" The high school band, a group of lanky teens with more enthusiasm than polish, launched into a cover of an old jazz standard. The notes weren't perfect, but the energy was infectious. And soon, a few brave souls, Lila among them, were swaying to the rhythm. Lila's lemon tarts had already disappeared, snatched up by eager hands, and she was now passing out slices of her famous pecan pie. If Claire thinks her store-bought cupcakes can compete with this, she's got another thing coming, Lila muttered to Margaret, her tone playful but pointed. Margaret glanced toward the hedge separating her yard from David's. Through the gaps, she could see flashes of movement. Claire's guests arriving, their voices bright and carefree. A pang of hurt flickered in her chest, but she pushed it down. This wasn't about Claire or David or even little Ellie, though Margaret's heart ached for her granddaughter. This was about proving something to herself, to her community, to anyone who thought age was a barrier to belonging. As the afternoon unfolded, more guests arrived. There was Mrs. Patel from down the street, her sari vibrant against the green lawn, her two young grandsons trailing behind her. There was Tom, the widower who ran the hardware store, shyly offering a tray of brownies he'd baked himself. And there were the children from Margaret's knitting classes, now teenagers, who showed up with their parents, their faces lighting up when they saw her. "Mrs. Ellis, this is awesome." One of them, a girl named Sophie, exclaimed, her braces glinting as she grinned. Margaret's backyard was a tapestry of ages, backgrounds, and stories, woven together by her refusal to be invisible. She'd invited everyone she could think of, people who, like her, had felt the sting of being overlooked. The elderly couple who rarely left their house because they felt out of place at community events. The single mother who worked 2 jobs and never had time for parties. The quiet boy from the knitting class who'd once told Margaret he felt like he didn't fit in anywhere. They were all here, laughing, eating, connecting. By 2 o'clock, the party was in full swing. The band switched to a lively pop song, and a group of children started an impromptu dance-off near the dessert table. Margaret clapped along, her heart swelling as she watched. She hadn't felt this alive in years, not since David was a boy, when they'd spend summer evenings chasing fireflies in this very yard. Back then, life had been simpler, her place in it unquestioned. Now, she was carving out a new space, one she'd built with her own hands. But not everyone was thrilled with the commotion. Margaret caught a glimpse of Claire through the hedge, her face tight with irritation as she glanced toward the noise. For a moment, their eyes met, and Margaret felt a jolt of defiance. Claire's party might have been exclusive, but Margaret's was expansive, embracing everyone who crossed her threshold. Let Claire stew, she thought. This was her moment. Still, a part of her couldn't help but wonder about David. Had he agreed with Claire's decision to exclude her? The thought gnawed at her, but she pushed it aside. David was a good son, always had been, but marriage and fatherhood had pulled him into Claire's orbit. Margaret didn't blame him, not entirely, but she wished he'd fought for her. Just a little. As the afternoon wore on, the party grew louder, more vibrant. The children had discovered the sprinklers Margaret had set up, and their shrieks of delight filled the air as they darted through the water. The elders, seated in the shade, swapped stories of their youth, their laughter mingling with the music. Margaret moved among them, refilling lemonade pitchers, thanking guests, and soaking in the joy she'd created. By late afternoon, the high school band took a break, and George seized the moment to tell another story, this one about a legendary Willow Creek festival from 50 years ago, when the whole town had come together to rebuild after a flood. "That's what we do," he said, his voice carrying across the yard. "We come together. We don't let anyone feel left out. The crowd nodded, and Margaret felt a lump in her throat. This was why she'd done this, not just for herself, but for everyone who needed a reminder that they mattered. As the sun began to dip, casting long shadows across the lawn, Margaret stood back and took it all in. Her backyard, once quiet and unremarkable, was now a living, breathing celebration of community. She'd turned Claire's rejection into something beautiful, something bigger than herself. But the day wasn't over yet, and Margaret had a feeling the best was still to come. The afternoon sun hung low, bathing Margaret's backyard in a soft, amber glow. The party was a living thing now, pulsing with energy as children raced through the sprinklers, their laughter rising like music. The high school band had returned, their upbeat rendition of a classic rock song drawing a small crowd of dancers, teenagers, parents, even a few bold seniors swaying with canes. Margaret stood near the dessert table, her hands clasped, watching the scene unfold with a quiet pride. This was her creation, her answer to being cast aside. But the harmony was short-lived. Through the hedge, the sounds of Claire's party grew sharper, louder music. The clatter of catering trays, the high-pitched chatter of young parents. Margaret tried to ignore it, focusing instead on Sophie, the teenage girl from her knitting class, who was teaching a group of younger kids how to make flower crowns. But then she heard Ida's voice, sharp and unmistakable, cutting through the hedge. Margaret's throwing a party. It was Claire, her tone laced with disbelief and something else, annoyance, maybe even embarrassment. On the same day as Ellie's birthday. Really? Margaret's stomach tightened. She hadn't meant for this to be a competition, but Claire's words made it clear that's how it was being perceived. She glanced at the guests around her, Evelyn arranging more flowers, George spinning another tale, Lila passing out cookies. They were oblivious to Claire's comment, lost in the joy of the moment. But Margaret felt the weight of it, the accusation that she was trying to upstage her daughter-in-law. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. This wasn't about Claire. It was about creating something meaningful, something inclusive. Still, a part of her couldn't help but wonder if she'd gone too far. Had she let her hurt drive her to pettiness? The thought lingered, but before she could dwell on it, a new sound caught her attention, a child's wail, sharp and piercing, coming from next door. Margaret's instincts kicked in. She moved toward the hedge, peering through the gaps. On the other side, a small boy, no older than 3, was sitting on the grass, clutching his knee. His mother was nowhere in sight, and the other adults seemed too caught up in their conversations to notice. Without thinking, Margaret pushed through the gap in the hedge, her heart racing. "Hey there, little one," she said softly, kneeling beside him. His face was streaked with tears, his tiny hands gripping his scraped knee. "Let's get you cleaned up." "Okay." The boy sniffled, looking up at her with wide, trusting eyes. Margaret gently lifted him, carrying him back through the hedge to her yard. She sat him on a chair near the dessert table and grabbed a first aid kit from her kitchen. As she cleaned the scrape and applied a bandage, she hummed a lullaby, the same one she'd sung to David when he was small. The boy's tears slowed, and soon he was giggling as Margaret made a silly face. "There we go," she said, ruffling his hair. "Good as new." The boy's mother appeared moments later, pushing through the hedge with a worried expression. "Oh, Tommy, there you are," she exclaimed, then turned to Margaret. "Thank you so much. I didn't even see him fall." Margaret smiled, waving off the gratitude. "He's a tough one. Just needed a little TLC." The mother, a young woman with tired eyes, hesitated. "This is quite the party," she said, glancing around at the vibrant scene. "I'm Lisa, by the way, from next door." Margaret, she replied, extending a hand. You're welcome to stay. Bring Tommy. There's plenty of cake. Lisa hesitated, glancing back toward Claire's yard. But Tommy was already tugging at her hand, pointing at the sprinklers where other kids were playing. Can we, Mommy? He asked, his earlier tears forgotten. Lisa laughed, a sound of surrender. All right, let's stay for a bit. As Lisa and Tommy joined the party, Margaret felt a flicker of triumph not over Claire, but over the moment itself. She'd turned a small act of kindness into a bridge, connecting her world to the one next door. More guests from Claire's party began to trickle over, drawn by the music and laughter. A young couple with a toddler, an older man who said he was a friend of David's, even a few of Ellie's playgroup parents. They came cautiously at first, but soon they were mingling, eating Lila's cookies, and joining the dance floor. Margaret caught sight of David through the hedge, his face a mix of confusion and curiosity as he watched the growing crowd in her yard. For a moment, their eyes met, and Margaret thought she saw a flicker of pride in his expression. But before she could dwell on it, Claire appeared beside him, her arms crossed, her lips a thin line. She didn't approach, but her presence was a reminder that this wasn't just a party, it was a statement. And not everyone was happy about it. As the afternoon faded into evening, Margaret's party grew even more vibrant. The fairy lights twinkled against the deepening sky, and the band launched into a slow, soulful tune. Couples swayed, children yawned in their parents' arms, and the elders shared quiet moments under the oak tree. Margaret stood at the edge of it all, her heart full but heavy. She'd created something beautiful, something that brought people together. But the rift with Claire and maybe David still lingered. Then, a small hand tugged at her skirt. She looked down to see Sophie, the teenage girl from her knitting class, holding a flower crown. For you, Mrs. Ellis, Sophie said, her voice shy but sincere. This party, it's amazing. It's like you made a place for everyone. Margaret's throat tightened as she placed the crown on her head, the soft petals brushing her hair. Thank you, Sophie, she said, her voice thick with emotion. That's all I wanted. As the night deepened, Margaret knew the party was more than a rebellion. It was a testament to the power of inclusion, of refusing to be invisible. But she also knew the story wasn't over. Claire's disapproval, David's silence, and the fragile thread of family still hung in the balance. For now, though, she let herself bask in the glow of what she'd built, surrounded by the people who'd reminded her of her own strength. The evening air was cool now, carrying the scent of roses and freshly cut grass. Margaret's backyard glowed under the fairy lights, their soft twinkle casting a dreamlike sheen over the party. The high school band had slowed their tempo, playing a gentle melody that invited quiet conversations and reflective smiles. Children, their energy spent, curled up on blankets with their parents, while the elders sipped lemonade and swapped stories of days gone by. Margaret moved through the crowd, her flower crown slightly askew, her heart a mix of triumph and unease. The party had grown beyond her expectations. Neighbors from Claire's gathering had crossed the hedge, their initial curiosity giving way to genuine enjoyment. Lisa and Tommy were still there, Tommy now fast asleep in his mother's lap, a half-eaten cookie clutched in his small hand. The young couple with the toddler had joined the dance floor, their laughter mingling with the music. Even the older man, David's friend, was deep in conversation with George, their heads bent over a shared memory of Willow Creek's past. But Margaret couldn't shake the weight of Claire's disapproval. She'd seen her daughter-in-law watching from the other side of the hedge, her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. David had been there too, his silence louder than any words. Margaret wanted to believe he was proud of her, that he saw the beauty in what she'd created. But doubt gnawed at her. Had she pushed too far? Had her defiance fractured the fragile bond of family? She was refilling a pitcher of lemonade when Evelyn sidled up, her eyes sharp despite the late hour. "You're worrying, aren't you?" Evelyn said, her voice low but firm. "I can see it in your face." Margaret sighed, setting the pitcher down. "I didn't mean for this to be a fight, Ev. I couldn't sit there and let them push me out." "And you didn't," Evelyn said, placing a hand on Margaret's arm. "Look around. Maggie, you've brought half the town together. People who haven't spoken in years are laughing together tonight. That's not a fight, that's a gift." Margaret managed a small smile, but her eyes drifted to the hedge. "Claire doesn't see it that way. And David, I don't know what he thinks." Evelyn followed her gaze. "Give him time. He's caught in the middle. But he's your son. He'll come around." Before Margaret could respond, a soft voice interrupted. "Mrs. Ellis." It was Sophie, the teenage girl from her knitting class, holding a small notebook. I wrote something for you. Can I read it?" Margaret nodded, surprised, and Sophie cleared her throat, her voice trembling slightly. "This party made me think of my grandma," she began. "She passed away last year, and she always felt like no one wanted her around because she was old. But you showed everyone here that it doesn't matter how old you are. You made us all feel like we belong. So, thank you." The words hit Margaret like a wave, washing away the doubt that had been creeping in. She blinked back tears, pulling Sophie into a hug. "You have no idea how much that means," she whispered. Sophie hugged her back, and for a moment, Margaret felt the weight of her purpose renewed. But the moment was fleeting. A shadow moved near the hedge, and Margaret turned to see David standing there, his hands in his pockets. The crowd seemed to fade as their eyes met, his expression a mix of hesitation and something soft regret. "Maybe." He stepped through the gap in the hedge, his shoulders hunched, and approached her. "Mom," he said quietly, his voice almost lost in the music. "Can we talk?" Margaret's heart thudded. She nodded, leading him to a quiet corner of the yard, away from the laughter and lights. They stood under the oak tree, its branches casting long shadows across the grass. For a moment, neither spoke, the weight of the day hanging between them. "I didn't know Claire told you not to come," David said finally, his eyes on the ground. "She said it was to keep things simple, that you'd be more comfortable at home. I should have questioned it." Margaret's throat tightened. "David, I'm your mother. I wanted to be there for Ellie. For you." "I know," he said, his voice breaking. "I messed up, Mom. I should have stood up for you. Claire's been stressed, and I didn't want to make things harder." Margaret studied her son, the boy she'd raised, now a man caught between loyalties. She wanted to be angry, to demand more, but she saw the conflict in his eyes. "I don't want to fight with Claire," she said softly, "but I won't be invisible. David. Not for her. Not for anyone." He nodded, his jaw tight. "This party, it's incredible, Mom. I didn't realize how much you could do. How much you still do." The words were a balm, but they didn't erase the hurt. Margaret reached out, touching his arm. "I just want to be part of your life. Ellie's life. That's all." David looked at her, his eyes glistening. "You are. I promise. You are." Before they could say more, a commotion near the hedge drew their attention. Claire was there, her arms still crossed, but her expression had softened slightly. She stepped into Margaret's yard, her eyes scanning the crowd before landing on Margaret and David. For a moment, no one moved. Then Claire spoke, her voice quieter than Margaret expected. This is something else. Margaret, I didn't expect this. Margaret held her gaze, unsure if it was an olive branch or a challenge. I wanted to celebrate too, she said evenly. For everyone who's ever felt left out. Claire's lips twitched. Not quite a smile, but not a frown either. Ellie's been asking for you, she said finally. Maybe you could come over for a bit. Sing her happy birthday. It wasn't an apology, but it was a step. Margaret nodded, her heart lifting slightly. I'd like that. As she followed David and Claire back through the hedge, the sounds of her party still echoing behind her, Margaret felt a flicker of hope. The night wasn't over, and neither was her story. She'd built something extraordinary today, and maybe, just maybe, it was the start of something new. Margaret stepped through the hedge, the sounds of her party fading slightly as she entered David and Claire's backyard. The scene was different, hereditier, more controlled, with pastel balloons tied neatly to chairs and a professional photographer snapping pictures of young families. Ellie, her granddaughter, was in a high chair at the center, her chubby hands smeared with cake frosting, her giggle cutting through the chatter. Margaret's heart ached at the sight, a mix of love and longing. Claire led the way, her posture stiff but her steps deliberate. David walked beside Margaret, his presence a quiet reassurance. The guests at Claire's party glanced up as Margaret approached, some with curiosity, others with faint smiles of recognition. She felt out of place in her blue cardigan and flower crown, but she squared her shoulders, refusing to shrink. Grandma, Ellie's voice, small but clear, broke the tension. The little girl reached out, her eyes bright with recognition. Margaret's resolve softened, and she hurried to the high chair, kneeling to meet Ellie's gaze. Happy birthday, sweet girl, she said, her voice thick with emotion. She brushed a curl from Ellie's face, her fingers lingering on the soft skin. For a moment, it was just the two of them, the world fading away. Claire cleared her throat, drawing Margaret's attention. We're about to sing, she said, her tone neutral but not unkind. Would you like to join us? Margaret nodded, standing as the crowd gathered around Ellie's high chair. David handed her a sparkler, and as the group began to sing Happy Birthday, Margaret's voice joined in, strong and clear. Ellie clapped, her laughter bubbling over. And for those few moments, Margaret felt like she belonged. When the song ended, the crowd cheered, and Ellie smeared more frosting on her face, earning laughs. Margaret caught Claire's eye, and for the first time, she saw something other than a flicker of respect. Maybe, or understanding. It was fleeting, but it was enough. As the guests returned to their conversations, David pulled Margaret aside. Mom, I'm sorry, he said, his voice low. I should have made sure you were here from the start. I didn't realize how much it meant to you. Margaret squeezed his hand. It's not just about me, David. It's about family. About not shutting people out because they're older or different. I want Ellie to grow up knowing that. He nodded, his expression solemn. She will. I'll make sure of it. Claire approached, holding Ellie, who was now rubbing her eyes sleepily. She's getting tired, Claire said, her voice softer than before. But she loved seeing you. Margaret. Margaret smiled, reaching out to stroke Ellie's cheek. Thank you for letting me be here. Claire hesitated, then spoke. Your party, it's really something. I didn't expect so many people to show up. Or to stay. It's for everyone, Margaret said simply. That's what I wanted. Claire nodded, and though she didn't say more, the air between them felt lighter, as if a small crack had opened in the wall that had separated them. Margaret knew it wasn't a full reconciliation not yet, but it was a start. She returned to her own party. The fairy lights still glowing. The music still playing. The crowd had thinned slightly, but the energy remained warm and vibrant. Evelyn greeted her with a raised glass. "Told you he'd come around," she said, her eyes twinkling. Margaret laughed, feeling lighter than she had all day. "It's not over yet, Ev, but it's a start." As the night deepened, the two parties began to blur together. More of Claire's guests wandered into Margaret's yard, drawn by the music and the promise of Lila's desserts. Children from both sides played together, their laughter mingling in the air. Even the high school band, now on their third set, seemed to play for both yards, their music floating over the hedge. Margaret stood under the oak tree, watching it all. Sophie approached, her notebook tucked under her arm. "Mrs. Ellis, can I help with anything else?" she asked. "You've done more than enough," Margaret said, smiling. "But stick around. There's still pie left." Sophie grinned, then hesitated. "My mom said you're like the heart of Willow Creek. I think she's right." The words settled in Margaret's chest, warm and grounding. She looked out at the crowd, old and young, neighbors and strangers, all brought together by her refusal to be sidelined. This wasn't just a party, Anna Maria, it was a bridge, connecting people across ages, across divides, across the hurts that had once kept them apart. As the final notes of the band's song faded, Margaret raised her glass, her voice carrying across the yard. "To Willow Creek," she said. "To all of us. Together." The crowd cheered, their voices rising into the night. And for the first time in a long time, Margaret felt truly seen, not just as a mother, a grandmother, or a 70-year-old woman, but as the heart of something bigger, something that would outlast this night and echo through the years. The moon hung low over Willow Creek, casting a silver glow across Margaret's backyard. The fairy lights still twinkled, though the crowd had dwindled to a few lingering guests, Evelyn and George sharing a quiet laugh under the oak tree, Lila packing up the last of her desserts, and a handful of children chasing fireflies across the lawn. The high school band had packed up, leaving behind a soft hum of conversation and the occasional clink of glasses. Margaret stood near the dessert table, her flower crown now wilted but still perched proudly on her head. The night had been a triumph, but it was more than that, it was a turning point. Margaret felt it in the air, in the way her neighbors lingered, reluctant to leave the warmth she'd created. She'd taken a stand, not just for herself, but for everyone who'd ever felt pushed aside. And the result was this: a community knit closer together, a family beginning to heal. David approached, Ellie asleep in his arms, her head resting on his shoulder. Claire was beside him, her expression softer than Margaret had ever seen it. "Mom," David said, his voice quiet but steady. "This was incredible. I don't think I've ever seen Willow Creek like this." Margaret smiled, her heart swelling. It's what happens when you open the door instead of closing it. Claire shifted, her gaze dropping for a moment before meeting Margaret's. "I was wrong," she said, the words coming slowly, as if they'd been wrestled into being. "I thought keeping things small would be easier. But I didn't see what it would do to you. To us." Margaret held her breath, unsure how to respond. She'd waited for this moment, but now that it was here, she felt no need to gloat or push. Instead, she nodded, her voice gentle. "We all make mistakes, Claire. What matters is what we do next." Claire's lips curved into a small, hesitant smile. "I'd like you to be at Ellie's next birthday. And maybe we could do something together. All of us." It wasn't a grand gesture, but it was enough. Margaret reached out, touching Claire's arm. "I'd like that." David shifted Ellie, who stirred but didn't wake. "We should get her to bed," he said, then looked at Margaret. "But we'll be back tomorrow, Mom, to help clean up and to talk." Margaret nodded, her throat tight. "I'll hold you to that." As David and Claire disappeared through the hedge, Margaret turned back to her party. The last guests were saying their goodbyes, their voices warm with gratitude. Evelyn hugged her tightly, whispering, "You did good, Maggie. Real good." George tipped his hat, his eyes crinkling with a smile. Lila pressed a leftover lemon tart into Margaret's hands, insisting she keep it for herself. Sophie was the last to leave, her notebook clutched to her chest. "Mrs. Ellis," she said, her voice soft, "can I come back next week? For knitting class. And maybe to talk." "Of course," Margaret said, pulling her into a hug. "You're always welcome here." As Sophie's figure faded into the night, Margaret stood alone in her backyard, the silence settling around her. The tables were strewn with empty plates. The fairy lights flickered faintly, and the air was thick with the scent of summer. She felt the weight of the day, the hurt, the defiance, the joy, the reconciliation, all of it woven into this moment. She walked to the oak tree, her fingers brushing its rough bark. This was where she'd stood with David, where Sophie had read her heartfelt words, where the elders had shared their stories. This tree, like Margaret, had seen decades pass, its roots deep in the soil of Willow Creek. It had weathered storms and droughts, just as she had weathered rejection and doubt. And tonight, it had been the heart of something beautiful. Margaret thought of her mother, who'd faced her own battles with exclusion and emerged stronger. She thought of Ellie, who would grow up in a world shaped by the choices made tonight. And she thought of herself not as a woman diminished by age, but as one whose fire still burned bright, whose heart still had room for love, for forgiveness, for new beginnings. The next morning, as promised, David and Claire returned. They brought Ellie, who toddled into Margaret's arms, her laughter a balm for the lingering aches of yesterday. Together, they cleaned the backyard, stacking tables and sweeping up confetti. Claire was quieter than usual, but her hands worked alongside Margaret's, and there was a tentative warmth in her glances. As they finished, David pulled Margaret aside. "Mom, I want to make this right. Not just for Ellie, but for you. You're not just her Grandmarie, the heart of this family." Margaret's eyes glistened, but she smiled. "Then let's keep that heart beating, David. Together." The sun rose higher, casting its light over Willow Creek, over the two houses now connected by more than a hedge. Margaret's party had been a spark, igniting something that would last far beyond one night, a reminder that no one is ever too old, too ordinary, or too overlooked to make a difference. And as she stood in her backyard, Ellie's hand in hers, Margaret knew she'd done more than throw a party. She'd reclaimed her place, not just in her family, but in the story of a town that would never forget this day.